How's everybody doing today? Excellent. I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation, and this is a busy day, full of great stuff. This morning, we had some of you didn't know this, but we had General Kayani of the Pakistani military here. Today, we are doing a fascinating release here with some great friends on U.S. opinions on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Tonight, we're hosting an event with the Director General of Al Jazeera. So this is a very big slice of lots of issues in a big region, and also looking at the American dimensions of some of this. We're streaming live on the Washington Note and on the American Strategist website on the New America Foundation site. Are we streaming anywhere else, Amjad? You're looking at me like I'm forgetting. Nope. Okay, good. My colleague Amjad Attallah, the co-director of our Middle East task force, helped initiate and put this program together, and I want to pay respect to Amjad and to his team for all they've done. And we have now, I think, an important, provocative, new, interesting survey done of public attitudes about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how Americans are looking at this by one of the great pollsters in the United States, someone I've enjoyed meeting, who says, who really needs no introduction, but I can't help introducing John Zogby. Yes. John, President and CEO of Zogby International. Founded Zogby International in 1984. I become addicted to, he would send out these things during the last election. I don't even know if he knew it, but he would send out these little teasers for little snippets of things that weren't out quite yet, and my blog became addicted to them. He's also, he may not know that I know this, he's close to the chairman of my director's council, Rita Hauser, who swears by all you do and breaks down much of the work. He's the author of many books. Most recently, The Way Will Be, the Zogby Report on the Transformation of the American Dream. And he's going to share with us the results of American public opinions on the U.S., on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how this plays out. But after that, we're going to have responses and discussion with several other people, and I just want to quickly say a few words now, and then we'll have a wide-ranging discussion with all of you. Carolyn, there's a seat right up here. Just don't be shy. Come right on up and take it. First of all, M.J. Rosenberg, many of you know, he is a fantastic, high-quality, provocative blogger in many places. I know him best through Talking Points Memo or TPM Cafe. He's probably lots of others under his own name, but that's the portal through which I look at MJ. He's a senior foreign policy fellow at Media Matters Action Network. From 1998 to 2009, he was director of policy at the Israel Policy Forum, worked on Capitol Hill for various Democratic members of the House and the Senate for 15 years, and he is just one of the real oracles, I think, in Washington that we're lucky to have to sort of think through in kind of a bare-knuckles way the various dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Even if you don't always agree with MJ, which I usually do, he shows a lot of respect and understanding of people on various sides of this. Next, Jim Zogby. I don't know if they're related or not. Jim Zogby, founder and president of the Arab American Institute, founded in 1985. I should say this is the 25th anniversary of the Arab American Institute. They're celebrating their gala dinner, everyone online should know, on April 21st. I think that the Arab American Institute is one of the vital institutions in town, and we should all be doing more to support Jim and paying respect to the whole group and what they've done in the past and what they will do in the future. In 2001, he was appointed to the Executive Committee of the Democratic National Committee. 2006, he was named co-chair of the DNC's Resolution Committee. And there's lots more stuff like that. But the cool stuff about Zogby is how he goes into things, and historically has gone in with inside the Democratic Party and shaken up the establishment, particularly on these questions of civil rights, human rights within the American context, and he's pushed the limits with people like Madeleine Albright and others who wanted to play certain safe games, and I have endless respect for what Jim has done in a highly constructive way. I'm usually much more destructive than he is, but he accomplishes things. And then lastly, my colleague Amjad Attallah, who's co-director of the Middle East Task Force here at New America, senior affiliated expert with Public International Law and Policy Group. He also was former advisor and really, I think, helped run the show on international policy and advocacy efforts of the Save Darfur Coalition. He blogs and writes and really is, with Daniel Levy, the animating force of much of our Middle East work here at New America. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to John Zogby, and then we'll be back to have a discussion.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Steve. Jim will tell you that actually sometimes we are related. It kind of all depends on the numbers, right? Yeah. I thought so. No. we were here just about a year ago, and in my business, you really never know what you're going to get. I think I've learned not to assume what public opinion is going to say, and then to look really hard at the numbers, look really hard at the internals. This turns out to be a very complex and fascinating poll. What we saw last year was a growing polarization on this issue, to the point where Jim has commented that this is the abortion, this is the gay marriage issue in foreign policy of our time. And what you see is even further polarization this year than there was last April when we were here. So let's get started. So this is a story actually about two polls. The one we did last year on the bottom, which was an online sample of 4,340, margin of error of 1.5, and those are the dates, April 1st through April 4th of last year. And then this year is a sample of almost 2,500 online again, plus or minus 2, and it was conducted fresh just last week, March 17th through the 19th. And I'll answer any questions about online polling methodology and so on if there are any. And so what is your opinion? Is your overall opinion of the Israelis, the Palestinians, very favorable, somewhat unfavorable, very unfavorable? And here you see in the tasteful lavender the favorable numbers, and in the ruddy color red, those are PowerPoint colors. This is the new Crayola, I guess, of our generation. Are this year's numbers. You see that the Israelis, Americans think highly of the Israelis, though there's been a hit from 71 to 65 in terms of favorability. Among the Palestinians, also a hit from 25% favorable to 21%. A slight hit for Prime Minister Netanyahu. These are Americans, of course, 53 to 49. President Abbas's numbers are quite low, dismal, 19 to 14.
Did they know who he was?
For the most part, no. I mean, there is a substantial number of undecideds. And don't hesitate to stop if you have stop me if you have a quick question. Now, your opinion of Israel, overall 71 last year, down to 65 this year, still high. But look at the split here. Between Democrats and Republicans in particular. 54% had a favorable view among Democrats last year. That's down to 42% among Dems this year. That is really substantial, 13-point drop. And we see that among the pieces of Democrats as well, young people and African Americans, so on. All the way over on the other end, no hit among Republicans at all, 92%. Favorable. And among independents, somewhere in the middle, but still higher towards favorability, but a huge Democrat-Republican split. Now, the resolution, how important is the resolution of the conflict? Important or not important? Overall, 84% say it's important. That's really right across the board. The numbers are very similar when you get them that high. Has the conflict had a negative impact on the United States' interests in the Middle East? Here's a point of consensus, which is really intriguing. Overall, 81% say that it's had a negative impact, and 15% disagree. But it's 88% of Democrats, 77% of independents, 77% of Republicans. Really important that there is a point of consensus here. Now, opinion towards the Israeli settlements. Those who say the settlements are legitimate are 1/3. Overall, 34%. Settlements should be stopped, 40%. Because we did not explain the settlements, you still have 1 in 4 who say neither or not sure. That's not surprising at all. Now, the opinion towards U.S. settlement policy, 40% say that the United States should get tough. And certainly there are, and you have a 6-page memo that's available to you. We have the Democrat-Republican split for you, and there's a wide split here. But the U.S. should get tough, 40% overall. The U.S. should do nothing, 1 in 4. Neither are not sure, 1/3. Again, not surprisingly, asking a foreign policy question. Does the inability to stop the settlements make the United States, in the eyes of the world, more respected? 5%. 5%. 51% say makes the United States less respected overseas, and 44% no impact or not sure. Those are really two different responses, but no impact, not sure. But you have a 10-to-1 ratio there. The opinion on Jerusalem, we read balanced statements about whether Jerusalem should be divided and shared, or whether it should be strictly Israel's. Overall, it was an even split. 33% said should be divided, 35% should be Israel's. But again, look at the split. Democrats, and over on the right, Republicans, 50% of Democrats to 13 saying divided, but 16% of Republicans to 61 who disagree, and independents pretty much reflecting the middle ground, the overall numbers, in fact. Now, the same question broken down. The 18 to 29-year-olds, by and large, that's the group that I called first globals, first global citizens. Look at the difference there. And there is always a significant difference among 18 to 29-year-olds on foreign policy matters than really any other age cohort. They really are America's first global citizens taken as a whole. 45 should be divided, 25 should be Israel's. Every other age cohort has the numbers somewhat flipped or closer matched. Among African Americans, 33 to 26. Among conservatives and born-agains, two mainstays of the Republican coalition, the numbers are dramatically in reverse. How should President Obama pursue peace? Should he lean towards Israel, steer a middle course, or lean towards the Palestinians? You have almost 2 in 5 saying lean towards Israel, and half overall saying steer a middle course. Small percentage saying lean towards the Palestinians. But again, the tale of polarization, hyperpolarization on this issue. 11 to 73 among Dems. All the way over on the right, literally and figuratively, 71% of Republicans. Two different worldviews here. And among independents, interestingly, 50% say steer a middle course. How should Obama pursue Middle East peace? 18 to 29-year-olds, 28-58. African Americans, 24-58. And then those are two key Democratic constituencies, two key Republican constituencies, the exact opposite. And there we go. There's a lot more in the poll, but these are, I think, some pretty good highlights. Thanks. It's up to you.
Carolyn, if it's a clarifying question, otherwise we'll bring it. Let me bring the whole panel up, and I promise, Carolyn, you go first when we get to questions. Jim, Amjad, MJ. Thank you very much, John. I'd like to just maybe work through our three folks here and give them an opportunity to respond briefly to the poll, what you think of the findings are, and then I'd like to invite a discussion. I see some people standing in the back. You don't have to, particularly those who don't work for me. There are seats right on up here. Come, feel free to take them. And if you stand there, I'll come grab you and put you down there. So, okay, great. Jim, floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks, John, for doing this. I guess I'd want to start by emphasizing the point that John made in giving a little more detail to it, and that is this hyper-partisanship that we observe. There are some questions that when you look at them in the overall numbers, there appears to be a public ambivalence. And that ambivalence actually masks the fact that the numbers on each side of the partisan line are so dramatic that they end up balancing out as almost a 50-50. But the 50-50 is in fact only because you're putting together Democratic and Republican numbers and coming out that way. This mirror reflection, what John said, I'd call the sort of the gay marriage issue it's similar to that in the sense that you have, two different universes that the parties are inhabiting on this question. And I think part of it has to do with leadership. We first saw this begin to occur during the Clinton years, when the president embraced the peace process and tried to move it forward, and the Republicans after 1994 with the Gingrich Revolution literally focused their efforts on working with the then prime minister in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was elected a few years later. First started with the Likud lobby here in Washington, and then later when Netanyahu was elected, in an effort to sabotage the peace process, and you had this partisan thing begin to develop and take shape. And then during the Bush years, he took a different side, and that sort of exaggerated the Democratic numbers. And now we're seeing the reverse with if the country's divided on health care and the country's divided on almost everything else, they're going to be divided on this too. But the numbers seem to be growing as they were, and I think it's somewhat worrisome. The second thing I'd point to is some failures that I observed in leadership. Leadership accounts for the partisanship, but there are some failures in leadership as well. And first I want to look at the Palestinian numbers and the failures on that side. It is rather unbelievable that given everything that's happened over the last decade, even with the splits on the Palestinian side, and the Israeli numbers dropping, that Palestinians' numbers are dropping as well. When President Abu Mazen was actually first Prime Minister Abu Mazen, we did some polling for him here, and his favorable rating was 53%, and his unfavorable rating was about 26, 27%. And I remember saying to them at the time, this will not last. You will be defined. And your numbers are derivative of the fact that, number one, you're not Arafat, and number two, you've got the President of the United States and members of Congress embracing you because you're not Arafat. That won't last. And that his numbers now are in the mid-low teens is rather disturbing. They have spent very little effort introducing him to the American public. And so there frankly is no standard bearer. There is no voice of leadership that is defined by Palestinians. Voices are defined by others. And so too the Palestinian numbers, that they continue to drop, again is indicative of the fact that they simply do not do the work that needs to be done to make their own case. And secondly, there's a failure of leadership, I think, on the part of administrations. And I would go back to at least the Clinton years on this, in that we oppose settlements, but we don't make the case for why we oppose settlements. Or we, making the point, in other words, that it's not constructive, isn't quite instructive of what the problem is. And so the public is going to support the president as a majority or plurality do, and certainly his own party is supporting him. But I think the numbers are weak because people frankly don't understand exactly why they're supporting him or what is such a big deal anyway. And on the issue of Jerusalem, for example, here you have, I think, the worst example of no leadership and no definition of what's at stake. I'm just listening over the last couple of days to some of the blah, blah, blah coming out of folks here. Mike, what's his name?
Here meaning New America Foundation?
No, here in this capital city. Mike Pence, it was, saying that why stop Israel from rebuilding Jerusalem? Areas that we're talking about, number one, aren't historical Jerusalem, and number two, aren't being rebuilt. These are lands that are being built upon, in some cases for the first time, and being built upon by an occupying force, but no definition given, so that even the Palestinians say East Jerusalem, and it's not. These are actually Palestinian village lands but if you do not define, you are defined, and this has all been defined now as Jerusalem, and so it makes it easier to make the case that this is not a settlement, this is our capital. And the areas that we're talking about, going back in the Clinton years to when we were talking about Jebel Abu Ghneim and Har Homa, which is what it became, which is now a massive city, was a barren hill that was part of Bethlehem, not Jerusalem, and is now called a neighborhood. And so I think it's easier to lose the case when you don't make the case. And so I would say that part of the numbers I look at are, I think John is right, the demographics of the party accounts for it. I think there's also a leadership factor, but there are some weaknesses here as well that have to do with leadership, and I would point particularly on the Palestinian side to their failure to make the case. And I think also here in the U.S. on the part of the administration, to even when it takes the right position, doesn't make the case to the public, so that they get some support, but it's sort of soft support that can dissipate at any time. And I'll stop.
Great, thank you. Amjad, and if you'll grab the microphone, please.
Well, I'll just make a couple of comments. One to follow up from Jim's. I think what the poll showed was that there's also a significant amount of support for the president's positions if the president chose to mobilize it. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to guess, and this is a point that my colleague Daniel Levy made, I'm going to guess that the people who said that they support settlement building and the people who said that Jerusalem should remain Israel's forever are probably very adamant about that. And I'm going to guess that the people who, out of a sense of fairness, said, well, no, it should be divided or the settlements should stop, are probably also concerned about health care and immigration and a host of other issues, and don't have this as the kind of thing that wakes them up at night worrying about the apocalypse and Armageddon. And so I'm wondering if in those numbers there isn't an idea that there's a core group that's very adamantly opposed to peace. They wouldn't put it that way, maybe, that are adamantly opposed to an end of the conflict the way the president's outlined it. And there's a more ambiguous majority that supports the president but needs to be mobilized, in effect, by the president, which goes to Jim's, I think, leadership question. And the other point, I was stunned by the numbers. I was stunned by the numbers on how many people recognize the conflict as in the national interest of the United States and how many view the end of the conflict and the end of settlements as positively impacting American national interests. Secretary of Defense Gates repeated that today. It's been repeated in the last week by General Petraeus. Has been repeated by many other members of the military. National Security Advisor General Jones has said it a number of times. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton mentioned it more ambiguously, but mentioned it nevertheless at the AIPAC conference. There seems to be an overwhelming support, according to your poll, that this is in fact the case, that the majority of Americans accept this. What I would love to hear you tease out is how is it that so many Republicans recognize that this would be good for the United States, but at the same time, the poll numbers on whether those things that should stop, they're actually saying that they should continue. So what's the disconnect between them recognizing that this impacts American national interests, but at the same time still supporting it still supporting that action to continue?
Thank you. MJ? You can speak.
Just a little background here. I started working on this issue back in '74. I was right out of college, and I went to work at AIPAC as a volunteer during the '73 war, and I just stayed there for like a year and a half. I was hired and actually got paid between '82 and '86. So I had like 5 years. I've been involved with this stuff a lot, and I've seen the change. My politics have obviously dramatically changed. I mean, I'm not one of those people who would say, the way the Republicans always say, new Republicans, they say, I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party left me. I don't say that about AIPAC. AIPAC didn't, I left AIPAC. AIPAC didn't leave me. They are the same. They're worse than they used to be, even more to the right, but, I left. I changed my views. They became broader. Here's the most striking thing that comes through to me, this dichotomy between Republicans and Democrats. When I was working at AIPAC in the 70s, the number, and this would continue for a while beyond just the 70s, the number one supporters of Israel, and I'll just talk about the Senate because they're like the big names, was Alan Cranston of California, a liberal Democrat, Frank Church, For Idaho, liberal Democrat. Walter Mondale, Hubert Humphrey, Henry Scoop Jackson, who was a foreign policy hawk but a total domestic liberal. On the Republican side, and Ted Kennedy. On the Republican side, the big supporters, the ones who really went and battled to get the aid and all that stuff, were on the Republican side, it was Javits, Senator Javits of New York, Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, and Clifford Case of New Jersey. They were the three most liberal Republicans. Of course, we all know there are no such thing anymore as liberal Republicans. Those types, those known as Rockefeller Republicans, don't exist anymore.
Wait. No.
Sorry. Nixon Republicans are still around. Now you threw me off, man. Okay. In those
didn't want to
days,
be written out of existence. I might disappear.
No, you're a Rockefeller Republican, which makes you very relevant. He died in 1979. In those days, the old right, the Goldwater right, Goldwater running for president in '64, he creates the modern right, utterly indifferent to the Middle East and Israel. He didn't care. He was like an American individualist. He was an isolationist, more or less. He hated the Soviet Union. When I was at AIPAC, AIPAC could not get in the door. He had no interest. And all those Western-type Republicans from Wyoming and Montana and all those places where they're the reddest states in the country, their Republican senators were indifferent to Israel. I'm not saying it's good or bad. Their constituents didn't care and they didn't care. They were more like isolationists, which is the way America was historically. That part of the country was always more isolationist, furthest from the oceans and the lakes. What's changed? The South took over the Republican Party. The South took over the Republican Party. So what you have are Dixiecrats, they were the old Democrats, but who can't stand the Democratic Party when the Democratic Party became correctly perceived as the party that stood up for equal rights for African Americans. So you have a whole Republican Party shifting, the whole South shifts to the Republican Party over one issue. They don't like black people. Remember, Johnson predicted it when he signed the Voting Rights Act. He said, I lost this, we lost, everyone, they said congratulations. He said, yeah, congratulations, we lost the South for 40 years. It was not going to be 40, it seemed more like 400, but maybe not, but who knows. So you have the racism thing, the fact that we have eradicated the separation of church and state, essentially, which started, I have to say, when I think Jimmy Carter was the first, as a Jew, I noticed it, first president who talked about Christ. And that was just sort of like, whoa, presidents don't talk about Christ. It's sort of like, and then of course his was a benign form, but then it comes roaring in with the religious right and Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and all these people going to Liberty University to pay homage to him. And now you have the modern Republican Party, which has to cater to these racists. And that gets me to my fundamental point. It is not that they are pro-Israel. They are anti-Muslim. They do not like Muslims. They are on the side of Israel because they don't like Jews that much to start out with either. But compared to Muslims, they like Jews fine. They're infatuated with the Israeli army. Why? Because the Israeli army kills Muslims. This is what it's all about. And you hear it, I work at Media Matters, so we're monitoring this stuff all the time. When you hear them talk to I don't want to say the average American, but very certainly it seems like the average American south of the Mason-Dixon line, Muslim, someone said to me the other day I said, how's Keith Ellison doing? Because he's a Muslim member of Congress and with all these crazy wackos wandering around on the hill. I said, how's Keith Ellison doing? So, they don't bother with Keith Ellison. He's just Al-Qaeda. They don't even think, it's like they want to yell at the liberals. He's a Muslim, therefore he's out in the open. This is and that's what we saw on Saturday. The sheer hatred that has infused our politics, and the strongest strain in it right now, and the one you're allowed to get away with, is the anti-Muslim strain. So I just kind of don't buy into the pro-Israel thing so much as it's anti-Muslim.
MJ, thank you. Before we go to the audience and also to give John Zogby a chance, I want to throw in one sort of core question that I have to sort of, I don't know if this is an antithesis to what somebody said, but when I look at the data, I'm very disturbed in the sense that if I were to construct a political strategy, I think it's a flip of the coin on whether you grab independents and tilt towards where the Democrats are, or whether you grab the independents and tilt towards where the Republican pool is, because it would be easy for me, particularly with the Chicago crowd and Rahm and the way they think, is that the Democrats have nowhere to go, so you've got a significant portion of them captured no matter what their views are. The independents you're chasing, and if you can bring over some of the Republicans, then you could conceive a strategy to ask this question about the gap between the people who saw it as a major national security issue, but didn't, of creating a fake process that produced no results, while at the same time essentially generating an Israel tilting strategy. When I just look at the data, separate from any calculations of genuine national interest, I think that the triangulation strategy is one that would not tilt towards a genuine two-state process. I think politically what you've given is the roadmap for why this isn't going to be dealt with in any serious way under this administration. So I'd love to get your reaction to that, along with the reactions else. Jim wanted to jump on this.
John, go first on
Okay.
Yeah. Not to be rude, you may have seen that I just whispered something to Jim. I just wanted to let him know that this was a nice fucking crowd. And to show that you could do this without having a microphone so close.
And I said, people with goddamn dirty mouths get their... That's terrible.
I know it is.
My God.
But this
There is a diversity in this room and online. Yes.
I'm so embarrassed.
No, anyway, I see it the exact opposite.
I figured you might,
Yeah.
but I'd like to know why, because...
Yeah, because you know what? We have seen the numbers move on healthcare reform already. And that when there is presidential leadership, and what's the takeaway on presidential leadership from this poll is all those people that don't have any opinion on settlements. We oppose settlements, but, we talked about this. But for 30 plus years, no one has ever bothered to explain what this policy really is and what it means. And the chief communicator is always in the White House. So rather than just saying the settlement policy is wrong, it violates international law, it violates U.S. law, what is it that's being violated here? So that's not number one. I think also number two, we've just seen the beginnings of a transformation in terms of public opinion on healthcare reform. Mm-hmm. In the sense that when there is presidential leadership, build it and they will come. If I can just wax on that for a moment, I have always seen in the polling from day one and at the various low points during the debate that pretty much every element that made it into the health care reform package was always supported. It was Obamacare. It was the package as a whole that cost $1 trillion. It was death panels. It was, frankly, the result of when there is a lack of communication and a lack of taking a stand. That is what was happening. As soon as the president became involved, pushed it through, communicated it. Now what you're beginning to see, Gallup poll yesterday, I've got one that's coming out, I guess, this afternoon or tomorrow. But what you're seeing actually is that the Republican reaction that is so in opposition is beginning to create the Democratic intensity in support that wasn't there all the time. And I would suggest that it's parallel on this issue.
Yes.
I broke the numbers in the. I think you've all got a handout of the numbers. I broke the numbers out into 3 separate groupings, taking away the favorable to Israel, favorable to Palestinians, whatever. The first set is the place to start, and that is this an important issue? 80% yes. Does it negatively impact American interests in the Middle East, it not being resolved? Again, about 80% yes. Total consensus along both parties. You build your policy on that. The second set of numbers were policy options of how you deal with the current question, which is settlements. And in all three issues that we talked about, should you get tough, settlements not, et cetera, there was a plurality. And the interesting thing about the plurality in favor of getting tough, Israel shouldn't be doing them, and it negatively impacts America, we look weak if we can't stop them. On all three, what was interesting there was that it was not just a plurality, but it was Democrats and independents both were in the plurality, and it was the Republican numbers were so high that it threw it off the other way. The third set of numbers, and so you can, if you're going to triangulate, you don't triangulate with the other way. You triangulate with where the independents are. The third set of numbers were the fluffy, is Israel a friend? Is Israel whatever? And those numbers were where there was this ambivalence, and the ambivalence was 80% Democrats one way, 80% Republicans the other way, and independents smack dab in the middle, sort of the average between the two, and that was over the Jerusalem issue and that sort of thing. And so my sense is that the takeaway is that the president is right on in the way he's approaching this, and in fact, he stands to gain from independence more than lose, and he certainly secures his base with his own party by standing tall on this issue, in particular settlements being an obstacle, because it plays back into and perfectly resonates with the Petraeus message, is that this is dangerous to us, and we have to do something. We can't look weak. It does not help us at all.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and add a point. There's a column in this week's Newsweek, Jacob Weisberg, I think, and in it he suggests that the choice here now is whether or not the Democratic Party loses Jewish support. And I would suggest just a couple of things about that. There is not enough of a subsample in this poll to derive anything about Jewish support, except over the years, having polled American Jews and having polled with significant subsamples of American Jews, that remains bedrock, 75-25, a Democratic base remains bedrock solid as a liberal base on pretty much every issue across the board. What American Jews, I think, need to see from this issue is that it is the Netanyahu policy. It is the policy of the right in Israel, actually, that is threatening the support for Israel. The numbers there is a 13-point swing, favorable, unfavorable, from last year. That's significant in 1 year. And that also, it's the 13-point loss in favorability among the Democratic, those who identify themselves as Democrats, that could be troubling for liberal Jews. When we have polled Jews, we have always found very strong support for two-state solution, and contrary to what you're seeing as policy.
Jeff Goldberg wrote an interesting analysis of the AIPAC conference as well, where he said what's interesting is, it was a friendly critique, obviously, but a friendly critique that the way AIPAC had designed its conference and the substance of the meeting, it was representing 25% of the American Jewish community as opposed to the broader cross-section, which was more to your point. I'm going to open the floor and we can continue the discussion. So let me open the floor to questions, comments, keep them polite and civil. Let me go to Scott McConnell first over here, and then I'll jump to the front. Scott? And if I don't call your name, then you call your name.
I guess for John first, the poll, you do a poll, it counts everybody the same, but I wonder if there's any tabulations by income level, most of all. And it's kind of related to what you were just discussing about, do you think that there's any possibility that the Democrats could lose a lot of their fundraising base if they pursue what the policies of the majority of their base, their non-fundraising base, is proved? I mean, whether this sort of progressive again,
okay,
except for Palestine phenomenon.
Actually, do you have the numbers? Because I looked at that. Scott, it's interesting. College educated and higher income are on the
progressive side.
The progressive side of this issue in the numbers across the board. We have crosstabs on all of them.
Can I address a donor question, part of your question?
So, I mean, I just wanted to
Go ahead, but pull the microphone up to you, please.
Okay, on the, I think, I think on the, I think we talk about these big numbers, and particularly when we talk about the Jewish community, you have to recognize that the Jewish community is overwhelmingly liberal. Polls have been taken on this settlement issue so far, and a clear plurality supports Obama and not Netanyahu. But that's the overall number. The ones that matters are these donors. And that's a tiny percentage of the Jewish community. So I would say there are a couple of people to watch as to the pressure that's going to be put on President Obama. And there are Chris Van Hollen, who is the head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and is a diehard 100% AIPACer all the way. And his job is to raise money for the Democratic Party candidates, and Chuck Schumer, who's the Senate Campaign Committee. Both, I would say Van Hollen is even more AIPAC-y than Schumer. Schumer doesn't really pay any attention to it. Schumer is kind of like Anthony Weiner. He just goes through the motions.
But if I may,
and I just think those guys are the ones who are going to go to the president and say, "Mr. President, give us a break. Our numbers are dropping."
I would also say, though, just to put in a counterpoint, not a heavyweight counterpoint, that during the battle over John Bolton's confirmation vote, after he was appointed by President Bush to serve the United Nations, Chuck Schumer, and this is on the record, went into the Democratic caucus and said a vote against John Bolton is a vote against Israel. And the caucus rebelled against that, and on top of that, many other major structural donors of the Democratic Party said, we will not support the party. So there are counterweights in there, people who sort of engage the process with a sort of a no false choice approach. So I just want to say I agree what you're saying, but I do think that there are counterweights engaged, and I particularly know about the Chuck Schumer one in this particular case. This gentleman right here.
Yeah, from the Jerusalem Report. You polled the question whether the conflict hurts American interests in the Middle East. Did you also ask the question whether Israel is whether Americans see Israel as a strategic ally or the opposite?
Good question.
We didn't in this poll, but we have over the years, and it is seen as a strategic ally, but we don't have any measurement as to whether those numbers have fallen. But in this poll, the closest that we came was
does it weaken America, the relationship, or strengthen America? And the partisan divide was enormous.
Interesting.
Don't know. We didn't ask it the last time.
In the very, is that Dan? I can't tell who this is right there. Yes.
Mitchell Plitnick with B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. And this question is really for the whole panel. We've seen in Sheikh Jarrah, those of you who follow this closely, have seen a growing protest movement in Israel that has risen by sort of combining the big picture issues, the two-state issues, with human rights issues on the ground. And I'm sort of wondering, in this poll, I wonder how many people really know the impact of the settlements, the impact of the siege on Gaza, and what it means that continued building in Jerusalem is going on. I mean, I don't really wonder. I don't think most people really know what the situation is on the ground. And I'm wondering if when we're talking about leadership, you think it would be a good idea to present some of the situations, both in terms of the big peace process issues, not to play those down, but to start more aggressively combining those with the real human rights issues that are existing in the occupied Palestinian territories and for Israelis as well.
Can I ask you a quick question? Since you're involved in this, as opposed to making this a leadership, American political leadership responsibility to communicate, why do you think there aren't more, say, reporting? I mean, Ban Ki-moon's in Gaza. Why are not I shouldn't say you, but other institutions able to generate greater communications focus on the agenda you've laid out?
Well, in Israel we do. I mean, B'Tselem is regularly in the Israeli media. Here in the U.S., there's just a long history of not understanding the facts on the ground, I think. There's certainly J Street, Americans for Peace Now, the Arab American Institute, the new project, Middle East Net and Foreign Policy, Middle East Channel, and Foreign Policy. These things are getting the word out, And I actually do think that what's missing there is the component of hearing this from governmental leaders, because I think that of course generates much more media attention, whereas we hear a great deal, and rightly so, about attacks on Israelis, and that's, the media follows that lead. So I think that would be
Let me
why
go to the
that
panel,
hasn't
but
happened.
let me just add one little tidbit. When we did a New America Foundation poll of Israeli attitudes towards Obama and race, one of the interesting things, and I think you'll excuse me if I'm wrong, because I flew in this morning from the Middle East and got in about 6 a.m., but my recollection, Amjad, is that the popularity, the percentage of support for Netanyahu inside Israel was actually lower than the popularity of support in these numbers here in America. Just an interesting little tidbit that may have some correlation to the kinds of things you're talking about. But Amjad, real quickly.
I just wanted to comment on the human rights component. I think this actually goes to the questions that they asked in the poll about the Palestinian. The fact that the Palestinians are polling so low, to me, indicates very clearly that the American public still does not perceive this conflict as one necessarily between rights and wrongs. It doesn't view it as from the perspective of Palestinian human rights or Palestinian suffering or even Palestinian self-determination. It's still seen primarily from, this is affecting us, it's impacting us, it probably is impacting Israel's security, it's not good for Israel, it's not good for us. The fact that there's no Palestinian component to it, I agree with Jim, is a direct failure of the Palestinian side in particular, and their, I would say they're the larger community of nations that actually support them, to actually make a concerted effort to reach out to the American audience directly and explain to them what's happening. As a matter of fact, I think your group, B'Tselem, passed out video cameras to Gazans so that they could talk about and show to an Israeli audience what their normal lives are like. And some of the videos are very poignant, some of them are very mundane, but they show Gazans as human beings. Now, that's something that...
But that's different than confidence in a government. Because I talk to people all the time, and anecdotally, most people see the Palestinian government as inchoate, incompetent.
I don't think it's a government question, though.
Go ahead.
Look, I've been talking about this issue now since I started the Palestine Human Rights Campaign in 78. And I framed it this way then, and it still applies today. As understood in the American mind, the equation is Israeli humanity versus the Arab problem.
Right.
And humanity always wins. The press, the public, and leadership understand that there are real Jewish lives at stake. And they understand the pain and suffering of the Jewish people. This is a narrative that has, since the earliest days when Chaim Weizmann came here and talked about this is the battle of civilization versus barbarism, it was defined. And through the movie The Exodus and the book, it shaped in the American consciousness people versus a problem. And Palestinians are objectified in that way. And so the problem is that, and it's not just, I can't just say racism and let it go, because Palestinians have had now, a century to define themselves in America. And yet they make these sort of, justice, it's justice. Nobody gives a crap about justice. If it were justice, the Indians would be running America, But it's not about justice, it's about who you identify with and who are real people. And so I think you're absolutely right that the problem is we don't see people in Gaza. We don't see people in being uprooted from the land. The wall protects people from a problem. And so we understand that. And the rockets that fall in an empty place might hurt people, but starving a problem, who gives a shit? And that's what we're left with. And until Palestinians, and I think the Arab world in general, are able to understand that they have a story to tell and people to introduce, and it's not something that Jim Zogby can do for them. It's something that they have to do for themselves. They've got to bring people here and talk to people and introduce themselves as people and put themselves on a level equal to, not greater than, but the same as, so that their story and their children's story is equal to. They continue to lose
Can't wait
this.
till you get Abu Mazen on the Daily Show. We're going to go right here, and then this gentleman who's jumping out of his seat in the back. Yeah,
Hi,
yes.
I'm Cynthia Butler. I'm an attorney. And I have two questions, actually. One is, have you done any polling with respect to the religious right, evangelical versus other parts of Christianity, and their perspective on support of
Okay.
Israel, because I think it's theologically rooted. I mean, they believe it is, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I was wondering about is in 2005, there were those evictions in the settlements, and I think the U.S. reaction was mixed on that, and it pretty much tanked Olmert's numbers from what I gather. But what is the polling, if you recall historically, on what was the perspective in 2005 when there were all those evictions in the settlements?
Thank you. And we're going to go then. We'll go to the gentleman in the very far back. Yeah. No, not yet. We're going to go to the panel, but I'm telling my guy to give you the mic next. But, reactions?
On this issue, not specifically, on a multitude of issues, we have done polling that compares and contrasts evangelicals versus mainline non-Catholic Christians, and on a wide variety of issues. What you find is that the mainliners are very close to Catholic public opinion. They lean left on a lot of issues. They are swing vote on a lot of issues, whereas among evangelicals, skewed on the right. But we have to understand that those who identify themselves as born-agains or evangelicals, about 30% of them take liberal positions. That's been fairly consistent over the years. But on this issue specifically, no. Are we putting the crosstabs up? Are you Yeah. So on AAI's website, aaiusa.org, you'll see crosstabs, and we have a breakout at least for Catholics, for non-Catholic Christians, and then for born-agains.
That's interesting. And how about the question of the 2005 evictions?
No.
Is it? No? Okay. Yes, sir. You need to do it in the microphone, please. We're
Just a
streaming.
second comment on the getting the Palestinian side of the story out. From many years in the media, from being a city editor at a newspaper and sending a reporter out to cover some Palestinians who came through town and were talking about the situation there. My God, the next morning it was horrible at the desk. I mean, there was such a concentrated anti-effort that came in that the chilling effect is still there 20 years later. From having worked in trying to publicize some events like that as well, here in Washington, D.C., and New York, and in other markets, it's the same thing. The media just won't cover it because it's not worth it to them, the hue and the cry that will come the next day.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, certainly.
I think one of the changes that's taken place is the emergence of new media. It is
I see everybody. Just calm down.
It is impossible. It is impossible now for the lobby to suppress these stories. These stories come out in other ways. I mean, the number of hits that we all get, and we're talking about between all our efforts on the web, we're talking about millions of people get the words about individual cases. I just want to allude to one thing you said about the story. I have this Palestinian friend. He's more like I've adopted him, and he's from Gaza. He's 20 years old, and maybe some of you met him when he's in town. He does speaking. He has a bullet in his back. He was shot by the Israelis he was 15 years old when he walked out of his house. The UN came to visit his house, and a trigger-happy Israeli shot the 15-year-old kid in the back. He was amazingly saved, and even his walking was saved at Tel HaShomer Hospital in Israel. Where he was taken. This is before Israel was totally out of Gaza. Well, anyway, he goes around speaking. I just talked to him last night because I'm involved with his education and everything. He has to tell me what's going on. And he talked to this Hillel AIPAC group. He's at Northeastern in Massachusetts. So I said, well, what was it like? He said, well, there are a lot of them. He said, they came, my name is, name is what his name is. It's an Arab name. He's speaking about the situation. And I said, well, what'd you do? He said, I just told my story about how I was shot in the back, and it was an accident. and I was treated by these doctors, and I'm from Gaza, and and now And he tells about how he's always freezing because he has a bullet in his back and he's in Boston and the cold. So he's always buried under blankets. He says, I just told it. I just told it. So I said, so how do these AIPAC kids, how do they all react? I said, what did they say? And he said, what could they say? And he didn't, it was like, because he was an actual kid like them who had a terrible thing happen to him. And it's just like, I really think that the Palestinian side can do amazing things by putting out real Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. People have no idea who they are, what they look like, or anything. And the Israelis have been doing it since before the state was created. And I think you got to do it.
Yeah, this gentleman right here in the third row. Wait till the microphone comes.
Hi, my name is Faris Rawi. I'm actually a Christian Palestinian. And I was just, my question is about leadership and about, my question is, do you think there's a failure in the Christian leadership in this country to emphasize the significance of Jerusalem to the Christian community? Like, why is it that the Christian community here is more supportive of Israel when Jerusalem, the hardest topic here, is actually extremely important to Christians here? And that, do they forget, and I guess this question to you, Mr. Rosenberg, do they forget that there's a significant amount of Christian Palestinians? And that this is an important for all three religions, and it's not a holy war between Muslims and Jews.
So let me get just a quick reactions from folks here. We need to be brief, and then I'm going to begin clustering. There are a lot of folks. I want to get everybody on board that wants to be on board, but I'm going to begin clustering some comments and questions from the audience. But quick reaction to this question.
I know MJ wants.
No, I don't want to answer it.
I actually.
As long as it's brief, I don't care.
Have been dealing with this for a while. And do not believe that the religion dimension of Jerusalem is as compelling a story as the people story of Jerusalem. When Faisal Husseini would talk about the fact that it is the metropole, it's where people went for education, it's where they went to shop, it's where they went for their jobs, it's where they went to do their banking. That Jerusalem was the center. It was like he would say it's like Washington gets severed from Rockville. What does Rockville do? And people understand that. More than my holy places or whatever, I think it's hard after 100 years to trump the Jewish narrative on that one. And most Christians, frankly, don't give a crap about it. They're looking someplace else, Vatican or something else. It's a Muslim story. It's a Jewish story. It's really not as powerful a Christian story. On the other hand, I think it's my neighborhood, it's my house. We shoot people who put bushes 3 yards into our lawn, and we have neighbors going, having like rage over their driveway edged over onto my property. People understand property. People understand rights in that personal way. And that's the story about Jerusalem that I think has not been told.
Really quick. Please pay attention to the fact that there is a dynamic among Christian conservatives, that they're not what they were 10 years ago or whatever, a couple of years ago. Just look at the face. We've gone from a James Dobson and a Jerry Falwell and a Pat Robertson to a Rick Warren, to a Joel Osteen with a completely different secular message. And those are people that are listening to what's happening from below. It's people in their parishes, particularly in their congregations, that particularly are demanding that their pastors not talk about God and guns and gay marriage and so on. They want to talk about global hunger. They want to talk about global poverty. They want to talk about the rights of Christians overseas. That is a huge change that's taken place. It's been skewed certainly by the healthcare debate, but basically the overall tenor of who is a Christian conservative, who is a young Christian conservative in this country is changing.
Okay, I'm going to cluster some things. I had a great anecdote, but I'm not going to share it. We're going to take these three right now. Well, I'll tell you, one night I was at there was a party, it was raining, it was a big bloggers night, and I was walking in with Ariana Huffington, and who knew but Pat Robertson. And there was a rug. He tripped over the rug. There was a heavy marble floor that his head was going towards, and I saved him. And if all of you knew me well, you'd know how complex that is. So, this three, and then we'll come into this cluster here.
Thank you for your...
I've had back problems ever since.
Al Richmond, formerly State Department's Office of Opinion Research. The partisan divide which you discussed, Jim, actually is huge. And I would say it outdistances the partisan divide on most issues in our country. My question is, how does it compare to last year's partisan differences? And if it is a sharper divide, how do you explain it?
Thank you. Okay, and then the lady in red.
My name is Tayara. I am from Syria, a physician. I worked with UNRWA for since the 70s, and hi.
Okay.
So I really feel so sad and disappointed also, because after 40 years of occupation, we are still in the same point talking about peace and moving in and moving out, and there is nothing happening. Actually, Israel is not paying anything for its oppressing the Palestinians. And my question is for the panel and for you also, why does America insist to be the mediator in the peace process? Why not the UN go on and do whatever they have to do? Why are we insisting to be in the middle? Let them, whatever, let us get out. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. This gentleman right here. We promised to come to this side. It's just you're next.
My name's Lee Diamond. I'm just a local Jewish troublemaker who's in a state of fury at this point. And I just struck by something I've been thinking about that Mr. Zogby mentioned, is the level of ignorance here. And you listen to, talked about Pence and opinion makers in the Jewish community. There's a massive conventional wisdom wall that we just need to smash. And I guess I would just be interested in whether you guys have any insight on that, share that opinion.
Are you talking about the ignorance of those polled, or ignorance in Washington, ignorance here today?
Well, specifically the opinion makers. I'm talking about Martin Peretz. I'm talking about Abraham Foxman. The people that we read about online. I mean, the big people that dominate. And then AIPAC, who has so much power. I mean, it seems to me we need a massive protest which leads to lobbying Congress. It may have to be independent. Even J Street now seems to have a stake in being a player in Washington, which may undermine their ability to mobilize people on the street. I don't know. I'm just struggling with this.
I'm not a street person, but Amjad might be.
No, well, I think that it's hard to group those three questions together. So instead,
question about partisan divide, Israeli occupation.
Right. I remember the questions. I wrote them down. I'm trying to lump them together thematically. I think the basic thing that comes out from all these polls is that Americans, for one reason or another, feel very centrally related to this conflict at some level. So if you compare this to a lot of other conflicts, if you compare this to Bosnia or Kosovo or Darfur or any other issue prior to any extensive U.S. intervention in those conflicts, people did not even understand what the issues were. They wouldn't have been able to name the cities. They wouldn't have known where it was on a map. There's a strong relationship between, this is a domestic issue. It's not just a foreign policy issue. It's a domestic issue in the United States. It seems that the politics internally among Americans is very equivalent to the politics inside Israel among Israelis in the center and on the right. And I don't think the left has been represented, in terms of the attitudes reflected in the poll or in Israel. They generally aren't necessarily very prominent. But the center and the right are facing off against each other. And the politics are so mixed that you can have the foreign head of state of Israel come to the United States and go to Congress to seek congressional support against the President of the United States for pressure that he's putting on Israel. It's hard to imagine what other foreign policy issue has that kind of a domestic component that would allow a foreign leader to play in our sandbox. That's why the United States has to be the one that actually engages in this issue. It's a domestic as much as a foreign policy and as much as a national interest issue for us.
And on the partisan divide question, just one that I remember, in last year, the Democratic numbers, favorable, unfavorable for Israel, for Israelis, were 53 about to 40. And this year it's 42 favorable, 49 unfavorable. So there's a switch. And I think it has to do with the growing partisan divide generally, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
I just want to say that I think that the best thing that happened to the Middle East this week was passage of the health care bill. If you read the Israeli press, as I do, you will see that Netanyahu was being assured by Eric Cantor, these people like to tell lies even to themselves, that don't worry, it's not going to pass. Netanyahu was counting on going in there to see a weakened president, and he walked into LBJ or Franklin Roosevelt. And that changes the whole dynamic, and it makes it all possible for Obama to be the president on the Middle East that he promised on his second day in office when he called up all those world leaders.
One can hope. Let me just put my own, since you asked me, let me put my own view in here. One, I sort of respect, I don't think that Marty Peretz and AIPAC are ignorant. I just want to put that there. I think that they have a worldview, and what we saw in this data are competing sets of worldviews. And I think one of the questions that's very important is whether you try to get in the minds and perspectives and framing that other people have. I try to work very hard at that and try to understand it. I myself look at this issue as MJ referred to, sort of through a lens of a Nixonian realist. I look at what's happened in America's history at this point, a globally significant doubt in America's ability to achieve the objectives it sets out for itself. And so there are certain places in the world that have a weight far greater than the few million people that may be objective. And so one of the things, and particularly in a defining challenge, which I think the Middle East today, and I think in the way President Obama adopts, it's vital that we do this. I actually, to tell you the truth, and I hope you'll all forgive me, for me this is not about the Israelis and Palestinians. This is about American power and demonstrating that America can be a primary sculptor of global affairs again. And I tell people that U.S. power and its security relation with Israel is sort of like a New Orleans levee. It's not exactly getting better. And the equilibrium that I think used to be in the world has been thrown out of whack. Our allies are behaving differently, and certainly our foes are behaving differently. So you need to put together something and envision something that's not a false choice between Israel and Arab interests, but ultimately, sews them together. And we can't get there if we remain very fixed in a paralyzed, do nothing, move forward. So I tend to think it's not a function of ignorance. I think there are worldviews, but I also look at Washington, D.C. as a place, it's a free trade zone for pursuing political influence and ideas, and it does come down to a fundamental issue of pursuing things. If AIPAC narrowed it, took too little a part of the bandwidth, it created a market opportunity for other movers, and I am one who believes that this exists here. And so, on the question of getting out, I agree with Amjad. It's not a question of getting out. It's a question of, can you approach this in a non-false choice way? Can you put forward ideas in ways that would move us forward in a different way? And Zbig Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft, and David Ignatius, who was here this morning, co-wrote a book that we commissioned called "America and the World: Conversations on the Future of U.S. Foreign Policy." And in that book, if I'm correct, and I may be wrong on last, they identified the U.S.-Cuba relationship, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and the question of Armenia as the three issues, the particular issues driven by domestic dynamics in an antithetical way to the broad national security interests. And that as more of a spotlight is fashioned on these, it would become more and more difficult for that domestic political dynamic not to be unchallenged. And I think all of those are somewhat changing. But I'm not naive that thinks this is automatically easy, but I did want to throw that out there. So that's my view. Let me cluster a group of people here. This gentleman here, and we'll make them fast, and we'll get to everybody.
Charles Kestenbaum.
Yes. Thank you.
I'm surprised nobody has discussed yet the issue of the recent U.S. military taking positions on this issue and saying that they're causing our soldiers to die. If our right wing is one thing, they support our military and they're concerned about their well-being. Does that have any future dynamic?
Petraeus comment right here in the front.
Petraeus comment. Same question.
Petraeus comment. Yes, right here.
Eli Clifton, Interpress Service. Just taking off of the Petraeus theme here. The 81% who agree that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a negative impact on U.S. interests. I'm wondering, has that question or a similar question been asked in previous years or in other polls that you conducted, seeing as how that seems to be a hot button?
Thanks, Eli.
issue
And
right now?
then right here, we'll just grab all of you one. Don't use the opportunity by going down here just to keep asking. I've got I know, Diane, you always have a question, but I want to get the people that were up for it first. Sorry. Yes.
Samira Daniels. I've been involved in this issue for a long time too. As a Christian background person, the thing that I find peculiar, and I was wondering if any of you could comment on it, that the Arab Christians themselves have wavered, sometimes showing excellent advocacy, and other times not. And I've wondered if you have any comments on that.
Arab Christians, although I think we're talking more about Americans today, but fine question. American Arab Christians, okay. And who else was a long-term? This gentleman. You've had your hand up for a while.
I'd like this problem to be addressed. The Arab monarchies who detest the Palestinians. It's not just Israel. It's these monarchies who detest them, who do a brisk trade with Israel. I just wonder if this could be addressed. Thanks.
Arab monarchies that trade with Israel. Okay. Diane, I'll go ahead and take you. Just make it brief.
Question of divided or united Jerusalem. Is there another option of an international city?
Okay, divided, united Jerusalem, alternative. So, takers.
I started with the Petraeus.
But do it into the microphone, Jim.
I thought I made the comment about the Petraeus thing that I think that those two questions, the first two that I pointed in in the initial group of the issues around which there was an overwhelming consensus, and the 80%, it's an important issue and it's harmful to our broader interests. That building on that, the Petraeus comments I think are quite critical, and I think very central to the whole discussion. And he actually can be the better salesman right now.
I think it is interesting that David Petraeus is going to receive the Irving Kristol Leadership Award at the American Enterprise Institute Gala dinner this year. Should be fun.
His award will probably go the way.
I might go.
Yeah. And I don't think Arab monarchies detest Palestinians. I don't see that point. I just want to sort of make that observation. I think that's to the best of my knowledge, aren't doing any trading with Israel either.
And any response to Eli Clifton's comments, John, about the 81%, whether it was measured in other years?
No, it wasn't measured. There was a new question this year.
On the Petraeus
into the microphone.
I'm sorry. Just to emphasize the obvious, the Petraeus thing and the fact that Gates no one repudiated the original report about Petraeus and what he said is huge. I really think that after we forget what happened at AIPAC this week and we forget that Joe Biden, all these things, what's going to be remembered is that for the first time ever, and remember, this is the same Petraeus that when MoveOn.org took out that unfortunate ad saying Petraeus, the whole world erupted. It is almost as if General Eisenhower, came out with a statement. And as a soldier, it's very, very, very powerful. And if the right does not support him on this, it would just show that what you began by saying is that, well, the right cares about American soldiers. It would indicate that the right has become so ideological that they don't really care about American soldiers as much as they care about other things. So, but I think the Petraeus, it's so huge.
I just want to add too on that, because the story about the Petraeus briefing broke on the Middle East channel at foreignpolicy.com, and that not only was it not denied, Admiral Mullen office within 48 hours actually responded to say that they wanted to correct the characterization that he was stunned when he heard the briefing. Of course he wasn't stunned, because it's conventional wisdom. I mean, I think he was offended that people might think that he didn't know that this was a problem for American national interests. He didn't want people to think he was naive. And so there's, I think, a consensus that's been there for a long time, because actually General Petraeus last year, when he spoke at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said something very similar. He just went out of his way to say it again this year, and to say it a few more times in the questions and answers. I think that there's a conventional wisdom in the military that this has been a problem for them. The fact that the problem is manifesting itself now because we have so many troops so many boots on the ground, actually means that it has even more resonance for them. And I think maybe there's an impatience with the fact that it hasn't actually been resolved yet, or that they don't see that it's on a fast track to being resolved.
Well, there's an impatience because of Iran. I mean, what they don't want to say publicly, but what is the case is that Israel-Palestine, again, didn't matter because of Israel-Palestine. It mattered because the continued use of the grievance, we won't even go that way, but the best way to get a loosely knit convergence of interests between Arab states concerned about Iran and Israel, which is the sort of reigning superpower in the region, was to get over this issue. And so for them, it was part of the national security strategy of a kind of soft confrontation of robbing Iran running room. And you couldn't allow one to So despite David Makovsky, whom I respect on some levels for wanting to solve the land side of this, and also Dennis Ross, who say there is no linkage, that's absolutely untrue. Every senior military commander, intelligence official that I have spoken to at the highest levels of our government knows absolutely that there's a linkage between Israel-Palestine, the broad Arab interest in what we want to do, and the question of dealing with a growing sense of a threat from Iran.
And the resentment factor Petraeus points out, which I think is able to be exploited by Iran among Arabs generally,
right,
among Arab public opinion.
Right.
I want to get to Samira's question. Really
yes, sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Lebanese Christians, Arab Christians are not a political advocacy group to a great degree. From day one, did not come as Cubans came, for example, with an issue in X to grind. When we poll them, they solidly support Israel's right to exist. They solidly, equally support Palestinian rights, human rights, and every aspect of that side of the issue, but they're not allowed voice.
We're going to take the last two questions. This gentleman and you're right there. Let's take this gentleman. This one.
They have thin skin.
Who has thin skin?
It's very interesting in the polling.
Who is the they?
The Lebanese Christian part of our
you and me.
Of our.
You guys have thin. I know that.
Cut me, I bleed. No, it's very interesting when even during 9/11, after 9/11, when they weren't being targeted, right? Ask the question, are you afraid of being targeted in the future? 2/3 said yes.
Yeah, interesting.
And their sense growing over the last, since I've been doing this work, their sense of identification with issues that 30 years ago they had no interest in at all has grown significantly. But as John said one time going into the Lebanese bakery in Utica, he said, everybody's an Arab now. But that doesn't translate into actual work.
I'm really having such a good time and would love to keep this going. But we'll take this gentleman here and then right up in the front.
I'm Leon.
You're next, sir. Don't worry. We'll get to you.
I'm Leon Weintraub, University of Wisconsin, Washington semester in international affairs. I'd like to ask Jim Zogby about his remarks about the unbelievably low numbers of support for Palestine. And you mentioned it's a failure to get the right message out there. This recalls American annoyance with the Europeans because they didn't support us on the invasion with Iraq. It's just a matter of not getting the message out there. I think that they knew what the message was and they didn't like it. And I have a feeling it's pretty similar with the Palestinians in that the Palestinian message, accurately or not, is so associated with violence and terrorism. And whenever someone like Mahmoud Abbas or the Prime Minister make a positive support about reconciliation with Israel, it's disputed by someone either in Hamas or some other Palestinian faction. So I
would add perceptions of corruption or perceptions of incompetence.
Exactly as well. So and these people in fact are not in control of the Palestinian entity. So I think it's not so much the message; it's about what in fact is it.
Interesting. Thank you. And let's take you to this gentleman here, and then we'll wrap up. As much as I'd like to keep you guys here for another hour.
I have a follow-up of the General Petraeus question, and that is, I'm a little bit confused because in the Pentagon, Israel is very popular. I've been told it's hardly to criticize anything what the Israelis doing. They come and go every day at the highest echelons. So how do you see it? It seems to be a kind of contradiction what Petraeus says and what the mood in the Pentagon is.
Well, somebody else will take that one, but I want to get on this one.
Yes.
You're fundamentally wrong, I think. We're not here talking about corruption or bad leadership or even violence. We're not talking about policies. We're talking about people. The fact is that it's sort of like when I would deal with negative stereotypes of Arab Americans, and I'd go to see, they'd say, well, there are Arab terrorists, and I say, yeah, well, then there are Italian gangsters, and there are corrupt Jewish business people, and there are some lazy Mexicans. But the point is that Americans see in the media the broad array of all of those different communities so that they can put the negative portrayal in context and say, well, yeah, but, there's a lot of really good ones too. And therefore, what happens to an Italian or somebody Jewish or somebody Arab or somebody, is understood. The problem is that on the Palestinian side, that human story isn't told, isn't understood. And so there's corruption in Israel, and lots of corruption in Israel. There is a lot of violence in Israel, and Israel does a lot of violence. I mean, how do you end up with a situation where, 1,400 Palestinians die and a dozen Israelis die, and the story is how Israel suffers? How do you get that? How do you get there? How do you get to a point where you can starve Gaza now for years, and it's still not a story? It's not about Hamas. It's about the fact that we don't see real people there. They are invisible to us. Just like Rwanda is invisible to us, we still don't see them as the same and therefore of equal worth to tell their story or feel compassion for their story. So, I don't care about the policies of Mahmoud Abbas or about Hamas or the point is that when we're talking about human rights, which was the issue that was raised here, you can only have human rights if you're perceived by others to be human. And if you are not perceived to be human, then who gives a shit? You're just a refugee. Yeah. Or you're just an object who is tallied up as a number. This many died. But, me a couple of years ago, I did a story about in 1 week, there was a story that I think many of us will remember where an Arab sniper shot a Jewish baby in Hebron. And the baby was, I think, 3 months old. It was on the front page for 3 days in the Washington Post. The name, the parents, there were interviews and stories with the parents. And the same week, a 3-week-old Gaza baby was shot by an Israeli sniper. It was on the 7th line of an AP story, and it was the only mention. Didn't even make the Post or the Times. Baruch Goldstein did what he did. 2 front-page stories in style. How did the Jewish boy go bad? What happened to him? The names, Vice President Gore called us in for a meeting. He wanted to meet with us to express condolences. And I said, thank you, that's really sweet, and I'm very kind and thoughtful of you. But do you know any of the names of the Arabs who were shot in Hebron? Their names were never published in the American paper. They didn't count as real people. If they'd been Jews, we would have known them, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, their children. We would have had weeping interviews with them on television. They were real people and they count. Arabs do not count, and therefore the story does not get told. And the only people who can change that, ultimately, is the Arab side has to tell its story, and they don't.
We only have a few minutes. Thank you, Jim, for that. But let me say to Professor Weintraub, we're not going to take more questions, but I actually think the response to this is to get John Zogby, I will out him, he is Jim's brother, to do a poll on this, because I think it is interesting and important to raise these issues. I would tell you that my portal into this question, where I somewhat see both sides, has more to do with American politics and my very deep criticism of the Obama campaign for casting out a young lawyer named
Mazen
Asbahi during the campaign, because he had been on nonprofit board with a former perceived kind of the Jeremiah Wright of the
For exactly 3 weeks.
Muslim community for 3 weeks, 8 years before, that how much they ran gun shy of those issues during that campaign, which interestingly was not really covered either in David Plouffe's book or in Mark Halperin's book. But I think that to some degree that you get other measures, but the way to it is polling, which you guys do, and so we should come back. But quick responses in wrap up to these questions, and I have a response for you if they don't.
Okay. Well, my response, we'll see how it goes with yours, to your comment was, don't confuse Petraeus' comments with being anti-Israel.
Right.
So you juxtaposed it as, the Pentagon is still pro-Israel, but we hear these statements from Petraeus. The Pentagon is pro-Israel. Petraeus is pro-Israel. The entire U.S. establishment is pro-Israel. It's just that, as a matter of fact, the security and preservation of Israel is a vital national American security interest as the military defines it. So that's something that they're adamantly committed to doing. And that's why that's one of the reasons they believe that they have to actually end the Arab-Israeli conflict. Mm-hmm. It's because it is in Israel's best interest, that because it's one of America's national security. It's not America's only national security interest, but it's one of America's.
MJ, any final word?
No, because I'm doing this again with Jim tomorrow, and I'm used up all my words.
Okay. Any final comment? Let me just say in response to this question, because I think it's very important, that Bob Gates is Secretary of Defense and absolutely shared, we'll call it the Hegel-esque view, that there should not be a false choice between America's extremely important strategic relationship with Israel and the broader interest in the region, and that getting out of that zero-sum trap is critical. I know personally that Bob Gates, you can kind of imagine Bob Gates representing, if there has been a shift in view, the sort of Scowcroft view. That doesn't mean it's dominant, and it doesn't mean that everyone in the political sector agrees with where that is, but it does mean that I think the command staff and other generals who were very well respected, particularly Keith Dayton, who's been working hard to create a trained professional Palestinian security capacity. He made the comment as well that he can't do his job unless Palestinians have some view that there's a realistic track to a two-state. Otherwise, they will defect and he will lose them all, and we will have ultimately trained the enemy. So it's one to look at. I think that reflects it. The question is, when you hear at the same time political rhetoric that I think Vice President Biden and Hillary Clinton offered in a meaningful way despite the problems, that there should be no light between Israel and security, I find that offensive because I, as a patriot or whatever, look at sovereign countries. If I were Israel, I would say, there are areas in which interests converge and there are areas where interests diverge, and we should be mature and realistic about those. And I would say that kind of dynamic exists more in the military area than it does either in the dominant personalities that deal with this, either in Congress or some of the other apparatus of the administration. So I want to thank everybody. I know it's blisteringly hot in here. I want to thank those people who are watching online. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I want to thank our panelists, John Zogby, Jim Zogby, Amjad Atallah, and MJ Rosenberg. Thanks very much for joining.